The bullet that killed Specialist Warren passed close enough to Yara's face that she felt the heat of it. She dropped flat against the rocky outcrop as the valley erupted in gunfire from 3 directions. Somewhere behind her, Captain Whitmore was shouting orders that no one could hear over the chaos. 15 Rangers had walked into this valley 20 minutes ago. By the sound of the screaming, not all of them would walk out. Staff Sergeant Yara Okonkwo pressed her cheek to the cold stone and counted muzzle flashes on the ridgeline. 14, 15, 16 shooters in elevated positions. The patrol had walked straight into a kill box, and whoever planned this ambush knew exactly what they were doing. A round sparked off the rock inches from her hand. Yara rolled left, brought her rifle up, and sent 3 rounds toward the nearest flash. A body tumbled from behind a boulder 200 meters up the slope. 15 shooters now. "Delgado," she shouted. "Delgado, where are you hit?" The young private was crawling toward her, leaving a dark smear on the pale rocks. His leg, he gasped. His leg was not working right. Yara grabbed his vest and hauled him behind cover. She had carried wounded men before. She had carried her brother once, through streets that smelled like smoke and copper, though that was another life and another country, and she did not let herself think about it now. Return fire crackled from the Rangers scattered across the valley floor. Sergeant Vickers had found cover behind a disabled Humvee and was coordinating what was left of the squad. But they were pinned, outgunned, and the enemy held every advantage. Captain Whitmore's voice cut through the chaos. He was 30 meters to her right, exposed behind a low wall that would not stop rifle rounds. "Fall back to the vehicle," he ordered, "covering fire on my mark." Yara saw what he was doing. The captain was going to draw fire so the others could move. It was tactically sound and personally suicidal, and it was exactly the kind of decision Elias Whitmore had been making since she first served under him. She remembered the day he had found her sitting alone behind the motor pool, the anniversary of Kemi's death heavy on her chest. He had not asked questions. He had not offered empty words. He had simply sat beside her in the dust until the weight became bearable. That was who he was, the kind of officer who carried his soldiers even when they did not know they needed carrying. "Captain," Yara called out. "Captain, wait." But Whitmore was already moving. He broke from cover, firing as he ran, and every enemy rifle on that ridgeline swung toward him like compass needles finding north. The volume of fire was staggering. Yara watched him stagger, recover, keep moving. He was buying them seconds with his blood. "Move," Vickers roared. Everyone moved now. Yara grabbed Delgado and ran. Rounds snapped past her ears. Someone was screaming. She did not look back, because looking back meant stopping, and stopping meant dying. The disabled Humvee grew larger in her vision, and then she was behind it, dumping Delgado against the tire and spinning to provide cover. That was when she saw them take him. Captain Whitmore was down. Not dead. She could see him struggling, but 3 figures in mismatched uniforms were dragging him toward a technical vehicle that had appeared on the ridge road. He fought them, even wounded, even outnumbered. He fought until one of them struck him across the head with a rifle stock and his body went limp. Yara raised her weapon. The range was 250 meters. She could make that shot. She had made harder shots. Her finger found the trigger and began to squeeze. A hand grabbed her arm. Vickers, his face streaked with blood and dust. "No clear shot," he said. "You will hit the captain." She knew he was right. The bodies were too close, too tangled. She watched the technical disappear over the ridge with Elias Whitmore's unconscious form in the back, and something inside her chest turned to stone. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you know someone who has served in places like this. The extraction took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of fighting, retreating, calling for air support that arrived too late to matter. By the time the helicopters lifted what remained of the patrol off that valley floor, 5 Rangers were dead, and their commanding officer was in enemy hands. Yara sat in the helicopter's bay with Delgado's head in her lap. The young private had lost consciousness from blood loss, but he was stable. He would live. She kept her hand pressed against his bandage and stared at the mountains scrolling past the open door. That morning felt like another lifetime. She remembered sharing her water with a child in the village they had passed through, a little girl with dust in her hair and hunger in her eyes. The girl had reminded Yara of the children in her neighborhood in Lagos, before her family fled, before Kemi, before everything. She had given the girl her whole canteen and received a gap-toothed smile in return. That was 6 hours ago. Now Warren was dead. Kowalski was dead. 3 others whose faces she would see every time she closed her eyes were dead. And Captain Whitmore, the man who had believed in her when no one else would, was gone. The radio in the cockpit crackled. Yara could not hear the words over the rotor noise, but she saw the pilot's posture change, saw the co-pilot turn and look back at the wounded soldiers in the bay. Whatever news had just come through was not good. Vickers pushed forward to listen. When he returned, his face had gone gray. They intercepted a broadcast, he said. The man who took the captain. He calls himself Massoud. Former ANA turned warlord. Yara waited. He is going to execute Captain Whitmore in 48 hours. Live on video. Says the whole world is going to watch an American officer die for the promises America broke. Forward Operating Base Claymore was chaos wrapped in razor wire. Yara stepped off the helicopter into a storm of shouted orders, running medics, and the distant thump of generators that never stopped. The wounded were rushed toward the aid station. The dead were carried somewhere quieter. She stood on the landing pad and watched them take Delgado away on a stretcher. He had woken during the flight, grabbed her wrist, and asked if the captain was okay. She had not answered. Some lies were too heavy to speak aloud. Vickers appeared beside her. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves wants everyone in the TOC in 20 minutes, he said. Everyone who can still walk. Yara nodded. She did not trust her voice. The Tactical Operations Center was a plywood building that smelled like coffee and tension. Yara found a spot against the back wall and watched the room fill with the survivors of her patrol. 11 soldiers. 11 out of 15. The mathematics of violence reduced to bodies in folding chairs. Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Reeves entered, and the room went silent. She was a compact woman with silver threading through her dark hair and eyes that had seen enough war to fill several lifetimes. She did not waste time with preamble. At approximately 1400 hours, Captain Elias Whitmore was captured by forces loyal to a militia commander known as Tariq Massoud. We have received communication indicating the captain will be executed in 48 hours unless unspecified demands are met. She touched a laptop and the wall screen flickered to life. The video that played made Yara's stomach clench. Massoud sat in a dim room, his face lit by a single lamp. He was perhaps 50, with a gray-streaked beard and the bearing of a man who had once worn a uniform with pride. When he spoke, his English was flawless, the accent almost American. I served your country faithfully for 7 years, he said. I believed in your promises. I brought my family out of hiding because an American officer swore they would be protected. He paused, and something ancient and terrible moved behind his eyes. They were not protected. My wife, my sons, my daughter who was 9 years old. They were not protected. The camera shifted to show Captain Whitmore, bound to a chair, blood crusted on his temple. He was conscious, his jaw set in defiance, but Yara could see the pain he was trying to hide. In 48 hours, Massoud continued, the world will watch this man answer for broken promises. Not just mine. All of them. Every family abandoned. Every ally betrayed. America will see what its word is worth. The screen went dark. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves let the silence hold for a moment. We are coordinating a rescue operation with JSOC, she said. Earliest deployment window is 72 hours. 72 hours. Yara did the math and felt the number like a blade between her ribs. The captain would be dead for 24 hours before rescue arrived. Dismissed, Reeves said. Get some rest. We will brief again at 0600. The room emptied slowly, soldiers moving like sleepwalkers. Yara did not move. She stood against the wall and stared at the blank screen where Whitmore's face had been. She thought about the day he had advocated for her transfer to the Ranger unit. Every officer in the chain had doubted her. Too quiet, they said. Too foreign. A woman from Nigeria with an accent and a chip on her shoulder. Whitmore had looked at her record, looked at her scores, and told the doubters they were wrong. He had staked his reputation on her potential. Now, he was going to die in some basement while bureaucracy calculated acceptable timelines. Yara found Vickers outside the TOC, smoking a cigarette he had sworn he quit. 72 hours, she said. He exhaled smoke into the darkness. I know. That is 24 hours too late. I know that too. She watched the amber of his cigarette pulse like a weak heartbeat. There's another option, she said. Vickers turned to look at her. Whatever he saw on her face made him drop the cigarette and crush it under his boot. No, he said. Whatever you are thinking, no. I know the terrain. I speak the languages. I can move faster alone than any strike team. You would be walking into a compound full of hostiles with no backup and no extraction plan. That is not courage, Okonkwo. That is suicide. The captain would do it for any of us. Vickers grabbed her arm, his grip harder than necessary. And if he were here, he would order you to stand down. You know he would. Yara pulled free. But he is not here, she said. That is the point. She walked away before he could respond. Her quarters were a plywood box barely large enough for a cot and a footlocker, but it was private, and privacy was what she needed. She sat on the cot and pulled a photograph from her vest pocket. Kimmy smiled up at her, frozen forever at 17, wearing the second-hand suit he had been so proud of. Her little brother, who had wanted to be a doctor, who had died in her arms on a street in Lagos because someone made a promise they did not keep. I could not save you, she whispered to the photograph. But I can save him. She began pulling gear from her footlocker. Night vision, extra magazines, water purification tablets, the tools of survival in hostile territory. The door opened behind her. She did not turn. I am not here to stop you, Vickers said. Yara looked over her shoulder. He stood in the doorway, holding a folded map. Massoud operates out of an old Soviet mining complex in the mountains, he said. I have been tracking him for 8 months. Guard rotations, approach routes, structural weaknesses. He stepped into the room and pressed the map into her hands. I cannot go with you. I have a family, but I will not let you go blind. Yara unfolded the map and saw hours of meticulous intelligence work. Every detail she would need. Why, she asked. Because the captain saved my life in Fallujah, Vickers said. And because someone should have the guts to do what the rest of us are too afraid to try. He left without another word. Yara studied the map until she had memorized every line, then burned it in her wash basin. No evidence. No trail. She checked her watch. 46 hours remained. She would leave at midnight. The midnight air outside forward operating base, Claymore, carried the bite of approaching winter. Yara slipped through a gap in the perimeter wire that she had identified 3 months ago during a security assessment. She had reported the vulnerability. No one had fixed it. Tonight, that oversight would save a man's life. She moved through the darkness like water through cracks, her footsteps silent on the rocky ground. The mountains rose ahead of her, black shapes against a sky salted with stars. Somewhere in those peaks, Captain Whitmore was counting down the hours until his death. 44 hours remaining. The first kilometer was flat terrain, easy movement. Yara kept to the shadows of boulders and scrub brush, her night vision painting the world in shades of green. Vickers had marked the known enemy patrol routes on his map, and she had committed each one to memory before burning the paper. 3 patrols swept this area between midnight and dawn. She needed to be past their range before the first one began. Her pack weighed 30 pounds. Water, ammunition, medical supplies, and a single ration bar she would not eat until she had no choice. Every ounce had been calculated. Every item served a purpose. She had learned to travel light in the forests outside Lagos, running from men who wanted her family dead. Some lessons never left you. The ground began to rise. Yara's thighs burned as she climbed, but she did not slow. Pain was just information. It told you that you were still alive, still moving, still fighting. She had learned that lesson from Kemi, who had smiled through the agony of the bullet wound in his chest and told her to keep running. To never stop running. She stopped. Voices ahead. 2 men, speaking Pashto, their words carried on the thin mountain air. Yara dropped to her stomach and crawled forward until she could see them. A 2-man patrol, earlier than expected, smoking cigarettes beside a large rock. Their rifles leaned against the stone, careless and within reach, but not in hand. Yara considered her options. She could wait for them to move on, but that would cost her 20 minutes she did not have. She could circle around, adding a kilometer to her route, or she could eliminate them silently and continue. She chose patience. Not every problem required violence, and 2 bodies would be discovered eventually. Questions would be asked. Alerts would be raised. She pressed herself into the earth and waited. The men finished their cigarettes. One of them made a joke that Yara did not quite catch, and the other laughed. Then they collected their rifles and continued their patrol, walking east while Yara needed to go north. She waited another 60 seconds before moving. The mountains swallowed her. By 0300, she had climbed 2,000 feet. The air was thinner here, colder, and her breath formed clouds that she had to control to avoid detection. The Soviet mining complex was still 12 kilometers ahead, but she could see its lights now, a faint orange glow against the mountain's flank like an infected wound. That was where they were keeping him. That was where Massoud was preparing his execution. A sound reached her ears. Engine noise, distant but approaching. Yara scanned the terrain and found a narrow crevice between 2 boulders. She wedged herself inside as headlights swept across the slope below. A convoy of 3 vehicles wound up the mountain road. Technicals, mounted with heavy machine guns, carrying reinforcements to the compound. Yara counted the men in each truck bed. 8, 10, 12, 30 additional fighters heading to join Massoud's forces. Vickers had estimated 40 men at the compound. If these reinforcements were not already included in that count, she would be facing 70. The odds had just gotten worse. Yara filed the information away and kept moving. Dawn found her on a ridge overlooking a valley she did not recognize from Vickers' map. She had veered slightly east to avoid another patrol, and now she needed to reorient. The sun was a red wound on the horizon, beautiful and dangerous. Daylight meant exposure. She needed to find cover and wait for darkness. A village sat in the valley below. 30 or 40 structures, mud brick and corrugated metal, smoke rising from morning cook fires. Yara studied it through her scope. Women carrying water. Children running between buildings. Men gathering in the central square. And soldiers. Massoud's men, identifiable by the red cloth tied around their arms, moving through the village with the casual arrogance of occupation. She watched one of them grab a woman by the arm and drag her toward a building. The woman struggled. A man, probably her husband, rushed forward to intervene. One of the soldiers struck him with a rifle, and he collapsed. Yara's finger found her trigger. The range was 600 meters. She could end that soldier before he knew death was coming. But she did not fire. One shot would bring every fighter in that village to her position. The mission was not this village. The mission was Whitmore. She watched the woman disappear into the building. She watched the husband crawl through the dirt. She memorized the face of the soldier who had taken them both, and she made a promise she might not live to keep. Then she found a sheltered position among the rocks and settled in to wait for darkness. 36 hours remaining. The day passed slowly. Yara dozed in intervals, never fully asleep, her rifle across her chest. She dreamed of Kemi. She dreamed of Captain Whitmore. She dreamed of the woman in the village and the soldier with the red armband. When she woke, the sun was setting and the mountains were on fire with orange light. She ate half her ration bar, drank sparingly from her canteen, and checked her weapon. The mining complex was 8 kilometers ahead. She would reach it by midnight if she pushed hard. Yara rose from her hiding place and began to descend toward the valley. She would skirt the village to the north, staying high on the slopes where the shadows were deepest. She was halfway down the ridge when she saw the smoke. Not cook fire smoke, not the thin wisps of morning routine. This was black and thick and rising from multiple points in the village. Buildings were burning, and through her scope, she could see Massoud's soldiers dragging people into the square. The screaming carried up the mountain slope like smoke from a wound. Yara pressed her eye to the scope and watched Massoud's soldiers drag 6 men into the village square. They forced them to their knees in a line, while women wailed and children were held back at gunpoint. One of the soldiers was reading from paper. Yara could not hear the words, but she understood the ritual. Accusations, crimes against the cause, collaboration with the enemy. The justifications tyrants always used when they wanted to murder. The first shot made her flinch. A man slumped forward into the dirt. Then the second, the third. Yara's hands were shaking. She could stop this. 600 meters was nothing. She could drop 4 of them before they understood what was happening. Maybe 5. And then she would die, and Captain Whitmore would die, and nothing would change except the number of bodies. She watched the 4th man die. The 5th. When the 6th fell, the soldiers began dragging the corpses away, while the women screamed and clawed at the men holding them back. One woman broke free. She ran not toward the bodies, but toward the edge of the village, toward the mountain slope, toward the darkness that might hide her. A soldier raised his rifle to shoot her in the back. He missed. The woman kept running, stumbling over rocks, her dress torn and her feet bare. She was heading directly toward Yara's position. Yara made a decision that violated every tactical principle she had ever learned. She rose from cover, caught the woman as she scrambled up the slope, and clamped a hand over her mouth before she could scream. The woman thrashed wildly. Yara held her tight and whispered in Pashto, "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not one of them. Please be quiet, or they will find us both." The thrashing slowed, stopped. The woman's eyes, wide and white in the darkness, found Yara's face and saw something there that made her go still. Yara removed her hand slowly. The woman did not scream. They stayed frozen in the shadows while soldiers searched the village edge with flashlights. The beams swept across the rocks, once passing close enough that Yara could see the dust motes dancing in the light. Then the searchers gave up and returned to the village, apparently deciding that one escaped woman was not worth a mountain hunt in darkness. Yara released her grip. The woman turned to look at her, and in the starlight Yara could see she was young, perhaps 25, with a face that had been beautiful before grief carved new lines into it. "You are American," the woman said in accented English. Her voice was hoarse from screaming. "Yes. Why are you here alone?" Yara considered lying. But this woman had just watched her husband or father or brother die in the dirt, and she deserved better than lies. "They took someone I'm trying to save," Yara said. "From the mining complex." The woman's expression changed. "Massoud stronghold," she said. "You're going there alone." "Yes. You will die." "Probably." The woman studied her for a long moment. Then she said, "My name is Fazila. My father worked in those mines when the Soviets were here. I know every tunnel, every passage, every forgotten corner." Yara felt something shift in her chest. Hope, maybe, or the particular madness that comes when impossible odds become slightly less impossible. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Fazila's eyes drifted toward the village, toward the smoke and the wailing. "Because my husband is one of the bodies in that square," she said. "Because Massoud killed my father last year for the same crime they invented tonight. Because I want him dead more than I want to keep breathing." The honesty of it hit Yara like a physical blow. She understood that kind of grief. She had carried it across an ocean. "You are injured," Yara said, noticing the dark stain on Fazila's sleeve. "A bullet," Fazila said. "It passed through. I can still walk." Yara pulled a field dressing from her pack and bound the wound as tightly as the woman could tolerate. It was not proper medical care, but it would keep her moving. "The mining complex," Yara said. "How far?" 6 kilometers if we take the mountain paths." Fazila winced as the bandage tightened. "But there is something you should know. Massoud is not just holding your American." Yara went still. "What do you mean?" "The soldiers talk," Fazila said. "They say Massoud captured 12 Afghan National Army soldiers last month. Men who refused to join him. He is holding them with your American. 12 more." Yara did the math. 13 prisoners total. One of her against 70 guards, trying to extract 13 people. "He is going to execute them all together," Fazila continued. "A massacre." He wants the world to see Afghan soldiers die beside an American officer. Proof that anyone who sides with America will share America's fate. 34 hours remaining. 13 lives. 70 enemies. Yara looked at Fazila. At her wounded arm, her bare feet, her eyes that held nothing but fury and loss. She should send this woman away. She should tell her to find safety, to survive, to let the American soldier handle American problems. Instead, she said, "Tell me about the tunnels." They moved through the darkness together, two women bound by grief and purpose. Fazila knew the paths that did not appear on any map, the goat trails and shepherd routes that wound between peaks. She moved well despite her injury, driven by something stronger than pain. As they climbed, Fazila talked. She told Yara about her father, a mining engineer who had tried to keep the complex running after the Soviets left. She told her about her husband, a teacher who believed education was more powerful than guns. She told her about Massoud, who had once been a respected officer before something broke inside him and turned his patriotism into poison. What broke him? Yara asked. Fazila was quiet for a moment. They say he trusted an American once, she said. They say the American made promises and did not keep them. His family died because of it. The mountain pass narrowed to a throat of stone barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast. Yara moved through it with her rifle raised, scanning the ridgelines above for any sign of sentries. Fazila followed close behind, her breathing labored but steady. They had been climbing for 3 hours. The mining complex was close now, perhaps 2 kilometers ahead, its lights visible whenever the terrain allowed a clear sight line. Yara could feel the weight of those lights like a physical pressure against her chest. Somewhere in that glow, Captain Whitmore was waiting. 12 Afghan soldiers were waiting. Time was bleeding away. 30 hours remaining. The path curved around a massive boulder, and Yara's boot found loose scree instead of solid rock. Her ankle rolled sideways with a sound like dry branches snapping. Pain shot up her leg, hot and immediate, and she went down hard on one knee. Fazila was beside her instantly. "How bad?" she whispered. Yara tested the ankle, rotating it slowly. Not broken. Sprain, maybe. Definitely damaged. She had trained through worse injuries, but training was not the same as combat movement through hostile territory. "I can walk," she said. The words came out through clenched teeth. She forced herself upright. The ankle screamed in protest. She ignored it and took a step, then another. Each one sent fresh fire up her calf, but the joint held. It would slow her down. It would not stop her. They continued along the path. Yara's pace reduced to something between a walk and a limp. The delay was costly. Every minute she lost was a minute Massoud's deadline grew closer. A sound reached her ears. Footsteps ahead, multiple sets, moving fast. Yara grabbed Fazila and pulled her off the path into a narrow gap between boulders. They pressed themselves into the shadows as a patrol of 6 fighters jogged past, close enough that Yara could smell the cigarette smoke on their clothes. The patrol did not slow. They were heading down the mountain, toward the village, probably rotating shifts with the men who had conducted the executions. Yara watched them disappear around the curve and let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "We should move," Fazila said. Yara nodded and stepped back onto the path. Her ankle buckled. She caught herself against the rock face, but the movement was clumsy, loud. A stone skittered away from her boot and clattered down the slope. Behind them, a voice called out in Pashto. Someone had heard. "Run," Yara said. They ran. Yara's ankle shrieked with every step, but adrenaline overwhelmed the pain. The path twisted upward, steeper now, the footing treacherous in the darkness. Behind them, shouts echoed off the stone walls. Flashlight beams stabbed through the night. A rifle cracked. The bullet sparked off rock inches from Yara's head. She spun, dropped to one knee, and returned fire. One of the pursuers fell. The others scattered into cover. "Fazila, keep moving," Yara shouted. "I'm right behind you." She fired twice more, buying seconds, then turned and scrambled up the path. Her ankle was a distant concern now, something happening to someone else's body. All that mattered was the next step, the next breath, the next moment of survival. The path opened onto a small plateau. Fazila was there, pressed against a rock formation, pointing toward a dark opening in the mountainside. A cave, or perhaps one of the old mining tunnels her father had worked. In here, Fazila gasped. They ducked into the darkness. The tunnel swallowed them, black and cold, and smelling of ancient stone. Yara activated her night vision and saw a passage stretching ahead, supported by rotting timber beams. Soviet construction, abandoned for decades. Behind them, the shouts grew closer. Flashlight beams probed the tunnel entrance. Yara found a position behind a fallen beam and aimed at the entrance. When the first pursuer appeared silhouetted against the starlight, she fired. He dropped. The second man dove for cover, and the others held back, unwilling to enter the kill zone. A standoff. Yara had ammunition for perhaps 20 more shots. The enemy had time and numbers. There's another way, Fazila said. She was clutching her wounded arm, fresh blood seeping through the bandage. This tunnel connects to others. We can go deeper, and if it dead ends, then we die in the dark instead of the light. Fazila's voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. But my father walked these tunnels for 15 years. I know which ones lead through. Yara made the calculation. Stay and fight, run out of ammunition, die. Or trust a woman she had known for 4 hours and hope the darkness was a door instead of grave. She chose trust. They moved deeper into the mountain. The tunnel branched, and Fazila went left without hesitation. Then right. Then through a gap, so narrow Yara had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, lost in the labyrinth. Finally, Fazila stopped. They were in a wider chamber, the ceiling lost in shadows above. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a steady rhythm like a slowing heartbeat. We rest here, Fazila said. 10 minutes. Then we continue. Yara wanted to argue. Every minute was precious. But her ankle was swelling inside her boot, and Fazila's bandage was soaked through, and pushing harder now might mean collapsing later. She lowered herself to the stone floor and closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Kemi came to her in the darkness behind her eyelids. Not the Kemi who died in her arms, but the Kemi from before, the one who laughed too loud and dreamed too big. He was sitting beside her on the floor of their tiny apartment in Lagos, helping her study English from a torn textbook. Fear is just a question, he said. It asks if something matters enough to be afraid of losing it. If you feel fear, it means you care. I am afraid, she whispered to the memory. Good, Kemi said. That means this matters. She opened her eyes. Fazila was watching her. You were talking in your sleep, Fazila said. Who is Kemi? Yara was quiet for a moment. My brother, she said. He died a long time ago. Fazila nodded slowly. The people we lose, she said. They do not leave us. They become the reasons we keep moving. Yara looked at this woman who had lost everything in a single night and still found the strength to guide a stranger through dark tunnels toward almost certain death. She thought about Whitmore, who had lost soldiers and still found the strength to lead. She thought about herself, running from grief for 9 years only to find it waiting for her in every shadow. Maybe Fazila was right. Maybe the dead did not weigh you down. Maybe they lifted you up. 28 hours remaining. Yara rose to her feet. The ankle hurt less now. Or maybe she had simply stopped caring. Show me the way, she said. The tunnel spat them out onto a ledge overlooking Massoud's compound. Yara dropped to her stomach and crawled to the edge, her scope already raised to her eye. The mining complex sprawled across a natural bowl on the mountainside, a collection of concrete buildings and rusted machinery that the Soviets had abandoned 30 years ago. Floodlights mounted on poles cast harsh white circles across the grounds. Guards patrolled in pairs, their movements disciplined and regular. Yara counted them methodically. 12 visible, probably 3 times that many inside. The main building was a squat structure at the center of the compound, its windows dark except for one room on the second floor, where light flickered behind heavy curtains. That was where the commanders would be. That was where Massoud would be planning his massacre. Fazila pointed toward a low building near the eastern wall. The prisoners, she whispered. My father said that building was used for equipment storage. Thick walls. No windows. Perfect for holding people you do not want to escape. Yara shifted her scope. 2 guards stood at the entrance. Through a gap in the door, she could see nothing but darkness. But Fazila was right. The architecture made sense for a prison. 26 hours remaining. A vehicle rumbled through the compound's main gate. Yara tracked it with her scope as it stopped near the central building. Men climbed out, 6 of them, and one was different from the others. He moved like he owned the ground beneath his feet. The guard straightened when he passed. Massoud. He was older than he had appeared in the video, his beard more gray than black, his shoulders slightly stooped. But there was nothing weak about the way he carried himself. This was a man who had commanded soldiers, who had killed and ordered killing, who had watched his family die and transformed that grief into something monstrous. Yara's finger found her trigger. The range was 400 meters. She could take the shot. End this now. End him now, and let chaos sort out the rest. But the guard would react in seconds. The prisoners would become bargaining chips or corpses. Whitmore would die before she could reach him. She lowered her rifle. Massoud disappeared into the central building. A few minutes later, the light in the second-floor window grew brighter, and she could see shadows moving behind the curtains. A meeting of some kind. Planning the execution, probably. Rehearsing the propaganda. We need to get closer, Yara said. Fazila nodded and led her along the ridge to a point where the slope descended toward the compound's rear wall. Here, she said. There's a drainage culvert that runs under the wall. My father used it to smuggle food to workers when the Soviets cut their rations. They waited for a patrol to pass, then descended the slope in a controlled slide, using the darkness and the terrain to mask their movement. The culvert was exactly where Fazila said it would be, a concrete pipe half-choked with decades of debris. Yara went first, crawling through mud and stagnant water that soaked through her uniform. She emerged inside the compound walls, in a shadowed corner between 2 storage buildings. Fazila followed a moment later, gasping from the effort of pulling herself through with her wounded arm. Yara checked her watch. 25 hours. She moved along the wall of the nearest building, every sense straining for danger. Voices reached her from somewhere ahead. She pressed herself into a doorway and listened. 2 guards were talking in Pashto, complaining about the schedule change. Yara's blood went cold as she parsed their words. Dawn tomorrow, one of them said. Massoud moved it up. He wants to catch the Americans while they're still planning their rescue. The other guard laughed. They will be watching their captain die while their helicopters are still on the ground. Dawn tomorrow. Not 25 hours. Not even close. Yara did the math and felt the numbers like a knife in her gut. The execution was in 6 hours. She turned to tell Fazila, but the woman's face showed she had understood. Her English was good enough. Her Pashto was native. She knew. 6 hours, Fazila whispered. Can you still do this? Yara did not answer. She was already moving, her mind racing through the implications. 6 hours meant no time for a careful reconnaissance. No time for a perfect plan. She would have to move fast and loud and hope that speed and surprise could substitute for numbers. She found a position where she could observe the prison building. The 2 guards at the entrance were relaxed, bored, unaware that death was watching them from 30 meters away. Beyond them, through the gap in the door, she could now see a faint glow. Lantern light, maybe. The prisoners were awake. Yara needed to see inside that building. She needed to know the layout, the positions, the obstacles. She needed to find Whitmore. A door opened in the central building. Massoud emerged, followed by 2 of his lieutenants, and walked directly toward the prison. Yara pressed deeper into the shadows and watched. Massoud entered the prison building. Through the gap in the door, she could hear his voice, calm and almost gentle. He was speaking English. Captain Whitmore, he said, I hope you have been comfortable. A voice responded, rough with exhaustion, but steady. Whitmore, I have had better accommodations, he said. The room service here is terrible. Massoud laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man who genuinely appreciated the joke. I always admired American humor, he said, even when I was learning to hate everything else about your country. A pause. Then Massoud spoke again, and his voice had changed. Do you remember Kabul, Captain? Spring of 2014. A young Afghan major who believed your promises. Yara saw Whitmore's shadow shift against the lantern light. He remembered. I trusted you. Massoud continued. I brought my family out of hiding because you swore they would be evacuated. You gave me your word as an officer. I was reassigned, Whitmore said. His voice cracked on the words. I tried to make sure the promise was kept. I left instructions. Instructions, Massoud repeated. The word dripped with contempt. Your instructions were ignored. Your replacement had other priorities. And while you were settling into your new posting, my wife and my children were being butchered by the men I had betrayed for you. Silence. Then Whitmore spoke, and his voice was barely a whisper. I am sorry. Sorry. Massoud's calm shattered. You were sorry. My daughter was 9 years old. She wanted to be a doctor. Did you know that? She used to practice on her dolls, bandaging their wounds, telling them they would be okay. Yara closed her eyes. She thought of Kemi, who had also wanted to be a doctor, who had also died because someone failed to keep a promise. Tomorrow at dawn, Massoud said, his voice controlled again. You will apologize on camera. You will tell the world what American promises are worth. And then you and these 12 men who made the same mistake of trusting your country will die together. A lesson no one will forget. Footsteps approached the door. Yara melted backward into the darkness as Massoud emerged. His face was wet with tears. He wiped them away with the back of his hand and walked toward the central building without looking back. Yara understood now. This was not just terrorism. This was not just revenge. This was grief transformed into poison. Massoud was not a monster. He was a father who had lost everything and decided that the world should burn. It did not change what she had to do, but it made the weight of it heavier. 5 hours and 40 minutes remaining. She turned to Fazila. I need you to leave, she said. Get clear of the compound. If I am not out by dawn, find a way to contact the American base. Tell them everything. Fazila stared at her. You cannot do this alone. I have to, Yara said. 13 lives are in that building. If we both die trying to save them, no one will know what happened here. Fazila looked toward the prison, toward the central building, toward the lights and the guards and the impossible odds. Then she looked back at Yara. My husband is dead, she said. My father is dead. I have nothing left to lose and everything left to give. I am not leaving. Yara wanted to argue, but she saw in Fazila's eyes the same thing she felt in her own chest. The need to matter. The refusal to let the dead have died for nothing. Stay close, Yara said, and do exactly what I tell you. Yara circled the compound through shadows, mapping every guard position, every patrol route, every pool of darkness that might offer concealment. Fazila stayed close, her wounded arm pressed against her body, her eyes sharp despite the pain. The prison building had only one entrance. 2 guards outside, at least 2 more inside based on the movement Yara had observed through the door gap. The walls were solid concrete, no windows, no weak points. A frontal assault would be suicide, but there was another option. Yara pointed toward a structure 50 meters from the prison. The generator building, she whispered. That is what powers the floodlights. Fazila understood immediately. Darkness, she said. You want to blind them. Yara nodded. The compound's lighting was its greatest defensive asset. Without it, 70 guards became 70 men stumbling in the dark while she moved through shadows she had already memorized. She studied the generator building. 1 guard at the door, probably more inside. The hum of diesel engines vibrated through the ground, a constant pulse that masked smaller sounds. That would work in her favor. There is a weapons cache, Fazila said, near the motor pool. I saw soldiers carrying crates there when we were observing. Explosives? Yara asked. Fazila shrugged. Ammunition at least. Perhaps more. A plan began to form in Yara's mind. It was not a good plan. It had too many variables, too many points of failure, too many ways to die. But it was the only plan that might work with the time she had left. For hours remaining, she explained it to Fazila in quick, clipped sentences. The weapons cache, the generator, the prison. Each step depended on the one before. Each failure point a potential grave. When she finished, Fazila was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You are asking me to trust you with my life." Yes. Fazila looked toward the prison building where 13 men waited to die. "I trusted my husband with my life," she said. "He is dead. I trusted my father. Dead. I trusted my country, and it filled with men like Massoud." She turned back to Yara. "But you came here alone, across mountains and through tunnels for a man who is not your blood. That is a different kind of person. That is someone worth trusting." Yara felt something loosen in her chest. Gratitude, maybe, or with the particular relief of not being alone. They moved toward the weapons cache first, staying low, using the scattered machinery and abandoned vehicles as cover. The motor pool was a graveyard of Soviet trucks and more recent technicals, their silhouettes angular against the floodlit compound. 2 guards patrolled the area in a lazy circuit. Yara timed their movements, counted the seconds between their passes, and found a window. She slipped between 2 rusted trucks and reached the cache building just as the guards turned away. The door was locked. She pulled her knife and worked the mechanism until it clicked open. Inside, crates were stacked floor to ceiling. Ammunition, as Fazila had guessed. Rifle rounds, machine gun belts, grenades. And in the corner, 3 wooden boxes marked with Cyrillic lettering. Old Soviet stock, probably unstable, definitely powerful. Plastic explosives. Yara took what she needed and slipped back out, rejoining Fazila in the shadows. 3.5 hours remaining. The generator building was more difficult. The single guard at the door was alert, his eyes scanning the compound with the focus of a man who expected trouble. Yara watched him for 5 minutes, looking for a pattern, a weakness, a moment of inattention. She found it. Every few minutes, the guard would turn to check the door behind him, making sure it was still secure. 3 seconds with his back exposed. Yara moved during one of those turns. She crossed the open ground in a silent sprint, her knife already in her hand. The guard began to turn back just as she reached him. Her hand clamped over his mouth. The knife found the gap between his vest and collar. He slumped against her without a sound. She lowered him to the ground and slipped inside. The generator room was loud and hot, 3 massive diesel engines roaring in the confined space. 2 technicians sat at a monitoring station, their backs to the door, headphones clamped over their ears to protect against the noise. Yara could have killed them. It would have been easy. But these were not soldiers. They were workers, probably locals pressed into service, and she had not come here to slaughter the helpless. She moved behind them like smoke, placed the explosive charge against the main fuel line, and set the timer. 15 minutes. Then she slipped back out the way she had come. Fazila was waiting. "It is done," Yara said. "Now the prison." They approached from a blind side, using a stack of empty shipping containers as cover. The 2 guards at the entrance were 30 meters away, visible in the floodlight glare, unaware that their world was about to change. Yara checked her rifle. 12 rounds in the magazine. 2 spare magazines on her vest. 36 shots total for 70 enemies. The math was not in her favor. She thought about Captain Whitmore, sitting in that dark building, waiting for dawn to bring his death. She thought about the 12 Afghan soldiers who had chosen the wrong side and were going to pay for it with their lives. She thought about Fazila beside her, a woman with nothing left except the will to fight. And she thought about Kemi. The night before he died, they had sat together on the roof of their building, watching the lights of Lagos spread out below them. He had asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up, and she had said she wanted to be brave. Kemi had laughed. "Bravery is not something you become," he had said. "It is something you choose. Every time. Over and over. You choose it until it becomes who you are." Yara looked at the guards. At the prison. At the darkness beyond the floodlights where death was waiting. She chose. 2 minutes, she whispered to Fazila. "When the lights go out, stay behind me. Do not stop moving until we reach that door." Fazila nodded. Her eyes were calm. The seconds stretched like wire pulled tight. Yara counted them in her heartbeat, in the rhythm of her breathing, in the small movements of the guards who did not know they were being watched. 90 seconds. 60. 30. The explosion was louder than she expected. The generator building erupted in a fireball that lit the compound like a second sun before plunging everything into absolute darkness. The floodlights died. Shouts erupted from every direction. Chaos bloomed like a flower made of fear. Yara was already moving. She covered the 30 meters to the prison entrance in seconds, her night vision turning the darkness into shades of green. The two guards were stumbling, disoriented, reaching for weapons they could not see to aim. She shot them both before they understood what was happening. The door was unlocked. She kicked it open and swept inside, rifle up, finger on trigger. Two more guards in the entry corridor, one reaching for a lantern, one raising a rifle toward the door. Two more shots. Two more bodies. The corridor opened into a larger room. And there, in the green glow of her night vision, Yara saw them. 13 men bound to chairs, their faces turning toward the sound of gunfire with expressions caught between hope and terror. Captain Whitmore was in the center. His face was bruised, his uniform torn, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He saw the figure in the doorway, saw the American equipment, saw the way she moved. "Okonkwo," he breathed. His voice cracked on her name. "We need to move," Yara said. She was already cutting his bonds. "Can you walk? I can run if you need me to." She freed him and pressed a pistol into his hands, the one she had taken from the second guard. Then she moved to the next prisoner, cutting ropes as fast as her knife could work. Outside, the chaos was beginning to organize. Voices shouted orders. Flashlight beams stabbed through the darkness. Massoud's men were recovering faster than she had hoped. 12 prisoners freed. 13. Yara pulled the last man to his feet and turned toward the door. 3 hours and 10 minutes remaining until dawn. 13 people to extract through a compound filled with enemies who now knew they were under attack. The easy part was over. The Afghan soldiers moved like men reborn. Whatever weakness captivity had carved into them vanished the moment weapons were pressed into their hands. They stripped the dead guards of rifles and ammunition with practiced efficiency, their eyes hard and hungry. Captain Whitmore took command without a word. He positioned men at the doorway, assigned sectors of fire, and coordinated their movements with hand signals that crossed language barriers. This was what he was trained for. This was who he was. "Staff Sergeant," he said to Yara. "Extraction route." Yara pointed toward the eastern wall. "Drainage culvert. It is how we got in. Wide enough for single file." Whitmore nodded. He turned to the Afghan soldiers and spoke in halting Pashto, gesturing toward the door. Yara caught enough to understand. "Move fast. Stay quiet. Follow the American woman." They moved. The compound was chaos. Flashlight beams crisscrossed the darkness like searchlights hunting escaped prisoners. Shouts echoed off concrete walls. Somewhere a vehicle engine roared to life, headlights sweeping across the grounds. Yara led them along the route she had memorized, using shadows and structures to mask their movement. 13 men plus Fazila, a chain of bodies following her through the dark. Too many. Too slow. Every second felt like a countdown to disaster. They reached the first checkpoint, a gap between two storage buildings that opened onto the main yard. Yara held up a fist. Everyone stopped. 2 guards were running across the yard, heading toward the prison. They passed within 20 meters without looking sideways. Yara waited until they disappeared, then signaled the group forward. Halfway across, a flashlight beam swept toward them. "Down," Yara hissed. 13 bodies hit the dirt. The beam passed over them, paused, then moved on. Someone had seen movement, but not enough to investigate. Luck. Yara did not trust luck, but she would take it. They reached the eastern wall. The culvert entrance was a black mouth in the concrete, barely visible in the darkness. Yara pointed, and the first Afghan soldier dropped to his belly and began crawling through. One by one they followed. Whitmore stayed at the rear with Yara, providing cover while the others escaped. His breathing was labored, and Yara could see fresh blood seeping through a bandage on his side, a wound she had not noticed before. He was hurt worse than he had let on. "Sir," she said, "you need to go." Whitmore shook his head. Officer's last, Staff Sergeant. You know that. With respect, sir, you are the mission objective. If you die in this culvert, this was all for nothing. Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe. Or the weight of knowing she was right. Okonkwo, he said. Why did you come? The question hung in the darkness between them. Yara thought about all the answers she could give. Duty, loyalty, the debt she owed him for believing in her. But the truth was simpler than any of those. Because someone had to, she said. And I could. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, turned, and crawled into the culvert. Fazila went next. Then Yara was alone at the entrance, her rifle pointed toward the compound, her heart pounding against her ribs. A shout rose from the direction of the prison. They had discovered the bodies. The empty chairs. They knew. Yara dropped into the culvert and crawled. The pipe was tighter than she remembered, or maybe her body was simply more exhausted than it had been hours ago. Mud and stagnant water soaked through her uniform. Her injured ankle screamed with every push forward. The darkness was absolute, pressing against her like a living thing. She emerged on the other side to find Whitmore organizing the group for movement. The Afghan soldiers had formed a loose perimeter, their stolen rifles pointed toward the compound. Fazila was tending to one of the prisoners whose wrists were bleeding from the ropes. The culvert, Yara said. We need to collapse it. Slow them down. Whitmore nodded. He turned to one of the Afghan soldiers and spoke rapidly. The man produced a grenade, pulled the pin, and tossed it into the pipe. 3 seconds later, a muffled explosion sent a shockwave through the ground. The culvert entrance collapsed in a shower of concrete and dirt. That would buy the minutes. Maybe. Yara led them up the slope toward the ridge where she and Fazila had first observed the compound. The terrain was treacherous in the darkness, loose rock and steep grades that tested even the strongest among them. 2 of the Afghan soldiers had to support a third whose legs had been damaged during his captivity. They were too slow. Yara could hear engines now, vehicles circling the compound, searching for the exit point. Massoud's men would figure out what happened soon. They would find another way out. They would pursue. The ridge was 200 meters ahead when the first headlights appeared on the mountain road below them. Yara dropped to one knee and raised her scope. A convoy of 3 technicals, mounted guns gleaming in the headlight wash, racing along the road that curved around the mountain. They were not heading toward the group. Not yet. They were heading toward the road junction that would cut off the only path back to friendly territory. They were trying to box us in, Whitmore said. He had moved up beside her, his breathing ragged. Yara calculated distances and angles. The convoy would reach the junction in 4 minutes. Her group would need at least 10 to reach the same point on foot. We need to stop them, she said. How? Yara looked at the ridge above them. A narrow path wound along its edge, overlooking the road. One shooter with a good angle could disable the lead vehicle, create a roadblock, buy time for the others to escape. Keep moving toward the junction, she said. I will catch up. Whitmore grabbed her arm. That is a suicide position, Okonkwo. Maybe. She pulled free. But those vehicles reach that junction. We all die anyway. This gives us a chance. She did not wait for him to argue. She was already running toward the ridge path, her injured ankle forgotten, her rifle clutched against her chest. The path was barely wide enough for her boots. To her left, the mountain rose in a sheer wall. To her right, a drop of 50 meters to the road below. One wrong step and she would fall. She did not think about falling. She thought about the convoy, about the junction, about the 13 people counting on her to give them a chance. She reached a position overlooking the road just as the first technical rounded the curve below. The range was 120 meters. The driver was visible through the windshield, his face lit by the dashboard glow. Yara steadied her breathing, found her aim, squeezed the trigger. The windshield shattered. The driver slumped. The technical swerved hard to the right and slammed into the rock face, blocking half the road. The second vehicle tried to brake. Too late. It crashed into the first with a crunch of metal and glass. Men spilled from the truck beds, scrambling for cover, shouting in confusion. The third technical stopped. Its mounted gun swung toward the ridge, toward Yara's muzzle flash. She was already moving, sprinting along the path as heavy rounds tore into the rock where she had been standing. The roadblock would hold for minutes at most, but minutes might be enough. She ran toward the junction, toward her people, toward whatever came next. 2 hours and 50 minutes until dawn. Yara found the group at the junction, pressed against a rock formation, while Whitmore scanned the road with a captured rifle. The Afghan soldiers had formed a defensive line, their faces tight with exhaustion and fear. Fazila crouched among them, her wounded arm cradled against her chest. Whitmore turned at her approach. His eyes swept over her, checking for wounds. "The convoy," he asked. "Blocked," Yara said. "2 vehicles disabled. The third is mobile, but they will need to clear the wreckage before they can follow." "How long?" 10 minutes. Maybe 15. It was not enough. The road to friendly territory was still 8 kilometers ahead, and they were moving at the pace of their slowest members. 2 of the Afghan soldiers could barely walk. One was being carried. "We need another option," Whitmore said. Fazila stepped forward. "There's a village," she said. 2 kilometers east. The people there hate Massoud. They lost sons to his recruitment. They might help, or they might turn us over to save themselves, Whitmore said. Fazila met his eyes without flinching. "Or they might fight," she said. "Some things are worth the risk." Yara looked at the road behind them, at the glow of headlights beginning to move around the wreckage, at the mountains ahead, dark and indifferent to human desperation. "The village," she said. "We go to the village." They moved east, abandoning the road for goat paths that wound through the rocks. The terrain was brutal, steep climbs and sudden drops that had to be navigated in near-total darkness. Yara's night vision was running low on battery. She switched it off to conserve power, relying on starlight and instinct. The first gunfire came from behind when they were halfway to the village. Muzzle flashes lit the ridge they had just crossed, rounds snapping through the air above their heads. Massoud's men had found their trail. "Return fire," Whitmore ordered. The Afghan soldiers turned and fired into the darkness, not aiming to hit but to suppress, to slow, to buy seconds. Yara added her rifle to the chorus, placing shots near the muzzle flashes, forcing the pursuers to take cover. "Keep moving," she shouted. "I will hold them." Whitmore hesitated for just a moment. Then he grabbed Fazila and pushed her forward, barking orders to the Afghan soldiers. The group scrambled down the slope while Yara crouched behind a boulder and made herself a wall between the enemy and the people she was protecting. She counted her ammunition. 18 rounds remaining. The muzzle flashes on the ridge multiplied. 10 shooters. 15. More arriving every minute. She fired when they advanced, ducked when they returned fire. The rock beside her head exploded in a shower of fragments that cut her cheek. She ignored the blood and kept shooting. 14 rounds. 10. A figure appeared on her right flank, trying to circle around. She swung her rifle and fired twice. The figure dropped. 8 rounds. The pursuers were getting bolder, leapfrogging forward in the darkness, closing the distance. Yara could hear their shouts, coordinating movements, directing fire. Professional. Disciplined. These were not village militiamen. These were Massoud's best. She fired until the magazine ran empty, then slammed in her last one. 12 rounds between her and death. A hand grabbed her shoulder. Whitmore, his face pale in the starlight. "Time to go, Staff Sergeant." "That is an order." Yara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to keep moving, to save himself, to let her buy him one more minute. But his grip was iron, and his eyes left no room for debate. They ran. The village appeared below them like a mirage, a cluster of mud brick buildings nestled in a fold of the mountains. Lantern light glowed in windows. Dogs barked at their approach. Yara could see figures emerging from doorways, drawn by the sound of distant gunfire. Fazila pushed to the front of the group, shouting in Pashto, her words tumbling over each other in desperate haste. Yara caught fragments. "Americans. Prisoners. Massoud. Help." An old man stepped forward from the gathering crowd. He was small and weathered, his beard white against his dark skin, but he carried himself with the authority of a village elder. He listened to Fazila, his face unreadable. The gunfire on the ridge grew closer. Massoud's men were descending toward the village. Minutes away now, the elder looked at the ragged group of soldiers, at the wounded being carried by the exhausted, at the American woman with blood on her face and empty magazines on her vest. He looked at Whitmore, who met his gaze without speaking. Then the elder turned and shouted orders to the villagers. Men disappeared into buildings and emerged with rifles, old weapons but well-maintained. Women gathered children and hurried them toward a central structure. Young men took positions at the village perimeter, their movements practiced. Fazila translated for Yara. He says Massoud killed his grandson last spring. He says this village has been waiting for a chance to fight back. The elder approached Whitmore and spoke. Fazila translated again. He says you will rest here. His men will delay the enemy. When dawn comes, you will go, and his village will face whatever follows. Whitmore shook his head. We cannot ask you to sacrifice yourselves for us. The elder replied, and this time his words were simple enough that Yara understood without translation. You did not ask, the old man said. We chose. The first enemy fighters appeared at the edge of the village. The villagers opened fire. Yara found cover behind a low wall and added her remaining rounds to the defense. Beside her, Whitmore and the Afghan soldiers formed a line, their captured weapons barking into the darkness. Fazila crouched with them, a pistol she had taken from a dead guard clutched in her uninjured hand. The firefight was chaos. Muzzle flashes in the dark. Screams of wounded men. The crack of rounds passing too close. Yara fired until her rifle clicked empty, then drew her sidearm and kept fighting. An explosion lit the night. Someone had thrown a grenade into the enemy's approach route. Bodies flew. The assault faltered. Then a sound reached Yara's ears that made her heart stop. Helicopter rotors. Multiple aircraft approaching from the west. She looked up and saw navigation lights in the sky. American lights, flying in formation, heading directly for the village. The radio, she breathed. The message got through. Whitmore was staring at the sky with an expression she had never seen on his face. Hope. The helicopters roared overhead, their door gunners opening fire on the enemy positions. Massoud's men scattered, their assault broken by the sudden arrival of overwhelming firepower. Searchlights stabbed down from the aircraft, turning night into day. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker, distorted but unmistakably American. Friendlies in the village, mark your position. Extraction inbound. Whitmore pulled a chem light from his vest, cracked it, and waved it overhead. Green light painted his face as the first helicopter began its descent toward the village square. 2 hours until dawn. They were going to make it. The helicopter touched down in a storm of dust and rotor wash. American soldiers poured from the aircraft, their weapons up, their movements precise. They established a perimeter around the village square in seconds, their training evident in every step. A medic rushed toward the wounded Afghan soldiers. Another headed for Whitmore, who waved him off and pointed toward the men who needed help more. Even now, even bleeding and exhausted, he was thinking of others first. Yara stood at the edge of the square and watched the extraction unfold. The villagers had retreated to their homes, their part in this finished, their future uncertain. The elder stood in his doorway, watching the Americans with an expression that held no joy. He knew what came next. When the helicopters left, Massoud would return, and the village would pay for its choice. She walked toward him. Fazila followed. The elder looked at Yara with eyes that had seen decades of war. You cannot stay, he said in Pashto. I understand this. Yara did not have the words in his language to say what she wanted to say. She reached in her vest and pulled out the one thing of value she carried. A challenge coin given to her by Whitmore when she completed ranger training. It bore the insignia of the 75th Regiment on one side and the words Rangers lead the way on the other. She pressed it into the elder's weathered palm. I will not forget, she said. Fazila translated. The elder looked at the coin, then at Yara. He nodded once, slowly, and closed his fingers around the metal. A voice called from the helicopter. Staff Sergeant Okonkwo. We need to move. Yara turned away from the elder. She did not look back. Some goodbyes were too heavy for eyes to carry. The helicopter's interior was cramped with bodies. Whitmore sat against the bulkhead, a medic working on the wound at his side. The Afghan soldiers filled the remaining seats, their faces slack with exhaustion and disbelief. Fazila had squeezed into a corner, her eyes fixed on the village growing smaller through the open door. Yara found a spot near the door gunner and strapped herself in. The aircraft lifted off, banking hard toward the west, toward safety, toward home. She looked down at the compound one last time. The mining complex was visible in the pre-dawn light, smoke still rising from the destroyed generator. Vehicles clustered around the main building, and standing at the gate, a solitary figure watching the helicopters depart. Massoud, even at this distance, even through the blur of motion and dust, she could feel his eyes on her. He did not raise a weapon. He did not shake his fist. He simply stood and watched as the woman who had destroyed his plans disappeared into the sky. Yara held his gaze until the helicopter crested the ridge and the compound vanished from view. The flight to Forward Operating Base Claymore took 40 minutes. Yara spent them in silence, her head resting against the vibrating hull, her eyes closed but her mind racing. The mission was complete. Whitmore was alive. The Afghan soldiers were alive. Against every odd, against every logical calculation, they had survived. But it did not feel like victory. It felt like a pause. The base appeared below them, a sprawl of tents and plywood and razor wire that had never looked more beautiful. The helicopter descended toward the landing pad where a crowd had gathered. Soldiers, medics, officers. Word had spread. The skids touched concrete and the doors flew open. Medics swarmed the aircraft, pulling wounded men onto stretchers, shouting vitals and instructions. The Afghan soldiers were guided toward the aid station, their first steps on American-controlled soil uncertain but alive. Whitmore refused a stretcher. He walked off the helicopter under his own power, one arm draped over a medic's shoulders, his jaw set against the pain. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves was waiting for him at the edge of the pad. She saluted. He returned it with his free hand. "Captain," she said. "Welcome back." Whitmore nodded. Then he turned and looked at Yara, who was climbing down for the helicopter behind him. "This soldier," he said, his voice carrying across the pad. "Staff Sergeant Yara Okonkwo." She came alone, through enemy territory, against impossible odds. She saved 13 lives tonight. The crowd had gone quiet. Every eye turned toward Yara. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. "I was just doing my job, sir," she said. Whitmore shook his head. "No," he said. "You were doing what no one else would do. What no one else could do." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked. "You came for me, Okonkwo. When everyone else was waiting for permission, you came." Yara did not know what to say. She had not done this for recognition. She had done it because the alternative was unthinkable, because some things mattered more than orders and odds and survival. Reeves stepped forward. "Staff Sergeant," she said, "I think we need to have a conversation about your future." For a moment, Yara's heart stopped. She had violated protocol, gone AWOL, conducted an unauthorized solo mission behind enemy lines. By every regulation, her career was over. Then Reeves smiled. "I am recommending you for the Silver Star," she said, "and when this deployment ends, I want you in my command staff. We need more soldiers who understand that sometimes the right thing and the permitted thing are not the same." Yara felt something release in her chest. Not relief exactly, something deeper. Validation. Recognition that the choice she had made, the impossible choice, had been the right one. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. Reeves nodded and turned away, already issuing orders for the Afghan soldiers' processing and medical care. The crowd began to disperse. The moment passed, but Fazila remained. She stood at the edge of the landing pad, still in her torn dress, still cradling her wounded arm, looking lost in a way that had nothing to do with geography. She had no home to return to, no family waiting. Everything she had known was gone. Yara walked toward her. The two women stood facing each other in the growing light of dawn. What happens now? Fazila asked. Yara thought about the question, about the village elder and his coin, about the bodies in the square, about the future that waited beyond this moment. Now you come with me, she said. We find you somewhere safe, somewhere you can start again. Fazila's eyes glistened. Why? She asked. Why would you do this for me? Yara thought about Kemi, about the promises made and broken, about the weight of survival and the responsibility it carried. Because someone did it for me once, she said, a long time ago, and I'm still trying to repay the debt. The sun broke over the mountains, painting the base in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere behind them, the war continued. Massoud was still alive. The village was still in danger. Nothing was truly finished. But for this moment, in this light, 13 people who should have been dead were breathing. And that was enough. That was everything. The debriefing lasted 6 hours. Yara sat in a windowless room and recounted every detail of the mission, from the moment she slipped through the perimeter wire to the moment the helicopter touched down. Intelligence officers recorded her words, asked clarifying questions, made notes that would become classified reports. When it was finished, she walked out into afternoon sunlight that felt like another world. The base had returned to its normal rhythm. Soldiers moved between buildings, vehicles rumbled along dirt roads. The distant thump of helicopter rotors provided a constant heartbeat. Life continued. War continued. The extraordinary had already become paperwork. Yara found Fazila in a medical tent, her arm properly bandaged now, her torn dress replaced with borrowed fatigues that hung loose on her frame. She was sitting on a cot, staring at nothing, her hands folded in her lap. They want to send me to a refugee processing center, Fazila said without looking up. Unkabui. They say it is safe there. Is that what you want? Fazila was quiet for a long moment. I do not know what I want, she said. I have spent so long wanting revenge that I forgot how to want anything else. Yara sat down beside her. The cot creaked under their combined weight. She thought about her own journey, the years after Kemi's death when survival was the only goal she could manage. The slow process of learning to want more than just the next breath. It comes back, she said. The wanting. It takes time, but it comes back. Fazila finally looked at her. How do you know? Because I'm still here, Yara said. And so are you. A commotion outside the tent drew their attention. Raised voices, the sound of boots on gravel, someone calling for a medic. Yara stepped outside and saw a group of soldiers gathered near the aid station. Captain Whitmore was at the center of the crowd, still in his hospital gown, arguing with a doctor who was trying to push him back toward the medical building. His wound had been properly treated now, stitches and bandages replacing the field dressing, but he was pale and unsteady on his feet. I need to see them, Whitmore was saying. The Afghan soldiers. I need to talk to them. Captain, you need to rest, the doctor insisted. You lost a significant amount of blood. Whitmore shook his head. Those men were captured because they trusted us. They almost died because of promises we made and did not keep. He pulled free of the doctor's grip. I'm not going to let them think we have forgotten them again. Yara watched him push through the crowd toward the tent where the Afghan soldiers were being held for processing. His steps were uneven, his breathing labored, but his determination was absolute. She followed. The Afghan soldiers looked up when Whitmore entered. 12 men, battered and exhausted, uncertain of their fate. They had been enemy combatants in American custody, then prisoners of a warlord, then rescued by the same Americans who had originally detained them. Their world had inverted multiple times in the span of months. Whitmore stood before them and spoke in his halting Pashto. Yara did not understand every word, but she understood enough. He was apologizing, not the empty apology of a politician or the careful apology of a diplomat. The raw, honest apology of a man who knew he had failed. He told them about Massoud, about Kabul, about the promise he had made and the family that had died, because he was not there to keep it. He told them that the same failure, the same broken trust, had nearly cost them their lives. I cannot undo what happened, he said. I cannot bring back the dead or erase the suffering. But I can promise you this. He paused, his voice cracking. I will spend the rest of my career fighting for your resettlement. For your families. For the future you were promised and never received. The Afghan soldiers listened in silence. When Whitmore finished, the oldest among them, a sergeant with gray in his beard, rose to his feet. He spoke in Pashto, and one of the younger soldiers translated. He says that words are easy, the translator said. Many Americans have spoken words. He says he will believe you when he sees his family again. Whitmore nodded. That is fair, he said. I will earn your trust, however long it takes. He turned and walked out of the tent. Yara followed him into the sunlight. Sir, she said, you should be in bed. Whitmore stopped walking. He stood with his back to her, his shoulders rising and falling with labored breaths. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Massoud's daughter wanted to be a doctor, he said. Did you know that? 9 years old, and she used to bandage her dolls. He told me that in the prison, before you came. Yara said nothing. She waited. I think about her sometimes, Whitmore continued. I think about what she might have become if I had kept my word. If I had fought harder against the reassignment. If I had done anything differently. He turned to face her. His eyes were red-rimmed, haunted by ghosts that would never leave. You saved my life, Okonkwo, but you did not save me from this. Nothing can save me from this. Yara thought about Kemi, about the weight she carried every day, the guilt that never fully faded. She thought about the photograph in her pocket, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. No, she said, nothing saves you from it, but you learn to carry it. You learn to let it make you better instead of breaking you. Whitmore studied her face. You speak from experience. My brother, Yara said. The word came out easier than she expected. He died because someone made a promise they did not keep. I joined the army because I wanted to be the person who kept promises, who showed up when it mattered. And did it help? Yara considered the question. She thought about the village elder and his coin, about Fazila and her uncertain future, about the 12 Afghan soldiers who would spend the rest of their lives wondering if this American was different from all the others. It helped me survive, she said. Whether it helped me heal, I'm still figuring out. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder. The gesture was awkward, unpracticed, but genuine. Thank you, he said, for coming for me, for telling me this, for being the kind of soldier I always hoped existed. Yara felt something shift in her chest. Not resolution, not peace, but something lighter than what had been there before. Get some rest, sir, she said. We have a lot of promises to keep. Whitmore nodded. He turned and walked slowly back toward the medical building, one hand pressed against his wounded side. Yara watched him go. The sun was beginning to set, painting the mountains in shades of fire and blood. Somewhere out there, Massoud was still alive, still grieving, still dangerous. But that was a problem for another day. Tonight, 13 men who should have been dead were sleeping in safety. And tomorrow, the work of keeping promises would begin. 3 weeks passed. The war continued its grinding rhythm, indifferent to the small victories and quiet heroisms that occurred within its machinery. Patrols went out. Intelligence was gathered. Somewhere in the mountains, Massoud rebuilt his forces and planned his next move. Yara did not think about him often. She had learned long ago that enemies were like weather. You prepared for them, you survived them, but you did not let them occupy space in your mind that belonged to the living. The Silver Star ceremony was held on a Tuesday morning, under a sky so blue it seemed painted. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves read the citation aloud while Yara stood at attention, her dress uniform crisp, her medals gleaming in the sunlight. The words described her actions in clinical military language. Infiltrated enemy territory, neutralized hostile forces, extracted prisoners under fire. They did not capture the fear, the doubt, the moment in the tunnel when she had considered giving up. But that was fine. Some things were not meant for citations. Captain Whitmore pinned the medal to her chest. His wound had healed enough for him to stand without assistance, though he still moved carefully. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, he pulled her aside. I have news, he said. The Afghan soldiers, their families are being processed for resettlement. It took some calls, some favors, some arguments with people who did not want to listen. But it is happening. Yara felt something warm spread through her chest. All of them, she asked. All 12. He paused. And the village elder. The one who helped us. I managed to get his family on the list too. It is not enough to repay what they did, but it is a start. She thought about the challenge coin, probably still in the old man's pocket. About the promise she had made without words. About the debt that can never be fully repaid, but could be honored in pieces. Thank you, sir, she said. Whitmore shook his head. Thank you, Staff Sergeant, for reminding me what this uniform is supposed to mean. He walked away to shake hands with the other officers who had attended the ceremony. Yara watched him go, then turned and found Fazila waiting at the edge of the crowd. The Afghan woman had changed in the weeks since the rescue. The haunted look had faded from her eyes, replaced by something quieter. Not peace exactly, but the beginning of acceptance. She had been granted temporary asylum status while her case was processed. Yara had pulled every string she could find to make it happen. It was not much, but it was something. I received a letter, Fazila said. She held up a creased envelope. From a village. From my cousin who still lives there. Yara's heart clenched. The village had been on her mind every day since the extraction. She had heard nothing about reprisals, but that did not mean they had not happened. What does it say? Fazila smiled. It was the first real smile Yara had seen from her. Massoud's men came, she said, 3 days after we left. They demanded to know who had helped the Americans. And the elder told them nothing. None of them told them anything. Fazila's voice carried a note of wonder. They burned 2 buildings and took the elder's goats, but they did not kill anyone. They were afraid, my cousin says. Afraid that the Americans would come back. Afraid of the woman who came alone and destroyed their compound. Yara did not know what to say. She had spent weeks imagining the worst, preparing herself for the guilt of having brought destruction to people who had shown her kindness. They are calling you something, Fazila continued. In the villages, in the valleys where Massoud's name used to inspire fear. They are calling you the ghost of Kynner, the woman who walks through walls and steals prisoners from warlords. It was not just me, Yara said. You were there. The villagers, Whitmore and the Afghan soldiers. Fazila shook her head. I was there, she said, but you were the one who came. When no one else would. When no one else could. You were the one who chose. The words echoed in Yara's mind. Kemi's words from a rooftop in Lagos a lifetime ago. Bravery is something you choose. Every time, over and over. She had been choosing for so long. Choosing to run when her family was targeted. Choosing to cross an ocean and start again. Choosing to join an army that would give her purpose. Choosing to go alone into enemy territory for a man who had believed in her. And now she was choosing something new. Choosing to stay. Choosing to lead. Choosing to be the person who kept promises in a world full of broken ones. What will you do now? Fazila asked. Yara looked across the base, at the soldiers moving between buildings, at the helicopters lifting off toward distant mountains, at the war that continued regardless of individual victories or losses. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves wants me on her command staff, she said. Planning operations. Training soldiers. Making sure the next mission does not require someone to go alone. And you said yes. Yara nodded. I said yes. Fazila reached out and took her hand. It was an unexpected gesture, intimate in a way that transcended culture and language. 2 women who had walked through fire together, bound by something stronger than friendship. Then I will say goodbye, Fazila said. For now, my processing will take me to Kabul, then perhaps to America. But I will find you again, Yara Okonkwo. This I promise. Yara squeezed her hand. I will hold you to that. Fazila released her grip and walked away toward the processing center. Yara watched her until she disappeared around a corner, then turned back to face the mountains. The sun was high now, burning away the morning chill. Somewhere beyond those peaks, families were being reunited. Villages were whispering about ghosts. A warlord was nursing his wounds and his hatred. And here, on this patch of dust and gravel, a woman who had crossed oceans to escape her grief had finally found a way to carry it. She pulled a photograph of Kemi from her pocket. The edges were soft now, worn smooth by years of handling. His smile was still bright, frozen in a moment before everything changed. I did it, she whispered to the image. I kept the promise. The wind picked up carrying dust and the smell of diesel and the distant sound of rotors. Yara tucked the photograph back in her pocket, over her heart, where it had always belonged. Then she straightened her uniform, adjusted her new medal, and walked toward the command building. There was work to do. There were promises to keep. And Staff Sergeant Yara Okonkwo was just getting started. If this story moved you, drop a comment about what resonated most. Have you ever known someone who went above and beyond when everyone said it was impossible? We would love to hear your story.